Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Lauren. I'm with Incline, the program administrator for the Illinois Adjustable Block Program. And today we're going to be giving a training webinar for the Part 1 project application. So the agenda for today's webinar, first I'll give an overview of the application process. We'll then go through an application example for both community solar and DG project applications. We'll then go through the batch submission process and what happens after that once the batches have been submitted. And then we'll have a question and answer session through the chat feature. So you should see the Zoom group chat. So you can type all of your questions into the chat and we'll answer all of the questions at the end. So feel free to type as we go through, but we won't be answering any of those chat questions until the end of the presentation. And we will be accepting questions on both the application process and the disclosure form process as well. Okay, so first and foremost, the application portal will open on the Illinois ABP website at 9 a.m. Central Time tomorrow, which is January 30th, 2019. Everyone that's on this webinar should have gotten access to the demo site, which will allow you to submit test applications. So all of that information entered in those test applications will be deleted tomorrow morning. We're going to shut down that demo site, and then all applications will need to be submitted on the live site on the Illinois ABP website. In order for any applications to be considered for the Block 1 lottery, if a lottery is necessary, all batches must be submitted by noon on February 13th, 2019. So that's a 2-week application window. Applications can be submitted by vendors directly through the Illinois ABP portal. And once you have at least 100 kilowatts of Part 1 project applications, you can submit a batch. The application just without a street number. At the time of batch submission, we won't review and approve any applications until the batch has been submitted and we've received that application fee. Additionally, applications won't be able to be edited by the applicant. All edits will be done manually by the program administrator. So if you have any small edits you need to make, once you submit the application before we review the application, you can send those directly to the program administrator via email or phone. Okay, so now we'll go through a project application example. Again, I know we've given you all access to the demo site. So the live site will look exactly like that, but we'll just walk through a project application just to answer any questions ahead of time you might have before you start completing applications. So to begin a new application, you will need to log into your approved vendor account on the Illinois ABP site. Starting tomorrow at 9 a.m., you'll see a new projects tab on the top menu bar of your screen next to your vendors tab. So you'll want to click on that projects tab. Once you're on the project tab, you'll need to select the appropriate approved vendor from the drop-down menu. So this would be a case if one login has multiple approved vendors. You can select different approved vendors, so just make sure you're on the right approved vendor. To begin a community solar application, you can click the Begin New Community Solar Project Application button, which is right under that approved vendor dropdown. Additionally, if you want to complete a DG application, you'll need to have already completed a consumer disclosure form. If you don't have any completed consumer disclosure forms, you can complete those on your vendor tab under number 3. So you will need to have a completed consumer disclosure form in order to do a DG project application. Okay, so step 1 of the project application. So step 1 is the same for both community solar projects and for DG projects. So you'll just need to enter a unique project name for your application and then the project location. For DG applications, this information will already be pre-filled from the information you entered on the disclosure form. And for community solar applications, you'll just need to fill in this information. We are aware of an issue that's been brought to our attention through the demo site by some approved vendors. For co-located DG sites, the demo site is not allowing you to submit multiple projects at the same location. So we are working on a fix for that. That will be live when the portal goes live tomorrow morning. So that was already brought to our attention. We're working on a fix for that. So that is step 1 of the application. Step 2, you need to enter the project owner and installer information. Again, if you've already done a disclosure form for DG applications, this information will already be pre-filled. For a community solar application, you just need to fill in the name of the owner of the project, and then the installer. If the installer is not known at this time, you can just select no. You won't need to fill in that information. You can also pre-fill this information with the approved vendor contact information. And then the owner information you can pre-fill with multiple selections as well. Step 3 of the application is where you'll enter system details and performance. So you need to select how many unique orientations your system will have, fill out all that information, and then enter the inverter size, inverter efficiency, ground cover ratio, and then select if your system meets the minimal shading criteria. The portal will automatically calculate your DC output based on the module power rating and number of modules that you enter into the orientation section of the application. And again, this step is the same on both DG and consumer community solar applications. Step 4 of the application. So the first part of step 4 is where you'll select the REC contract delivery amount for the 15-year contract. So here you have 3 options. You can either use the standard capacity factor, the PV watts production estimate, or you can enter your own alternative capacity factor. Right here is where we show you what you'll see if you choose to enter your own alternative capacity factor. So you'll just need to enter the capacity factor and then type an explanation of that capacity factor. There also is an option on the last step of the application for additional uploads. So if you don't think you can explain your capacity factor here in text, you're welcome to write "see additional uploads" and then upload a PDF with the information for your capacity factor on that last step. After you've selected your REC contract delivery amount, you'll need to enter the name of the utility you're interconnecting with and then the interconnection approval date. We've gotten this question multiple times today. If you put the interconnection approval date as a date in the past, then you will need to enter your REC tracking system, the unit ID, and then select if you have a net metering application approval letter. But if the interconnection approval date is in the future, then this box here, this information will not pop up. So this is only required if your system is already interconnected and energized. So make sure you're selecting the correct date there, so you don't have to fill in information that's not required for you. So then also on step 4, so this is for community solar only. You won't see this if you have a DG application. Once you fill in the interconnection details, community solar systems will need to complete the non-ministerial permit attestation. So to complete that attestation, you just need to check the box, enter the number of non-ministerial permits you've obtained, and then enter the relevant information for those non-ministerial permits. So if you select 2, then 2 different boxes will show up here where you have to enter this information. So that's how you complete that attestation. Also, community solar specific questions, you need to indicate here if you commit to obtaining 50% small subscribers. You need to describe your proposed subscription model and then describe the expected mix of residential and non-residential subscribers. So those are both just free text box where you can type the responses. So step 5 is the document upload step of the application. So all applications, regardless of size, whether they're community solar or DG, will require a shading study and proof of site control to be uploaded. All applications over 25 kilowatts will require a signed interconnection agreement. All ground-mounted systems will require a site map or plot diagram. And then all systems that are already interconnected and energized will require a certificate of completion, a net metering approval letter, if applicable, and photographic documentation of the installation. So again, those are only required if you select that your interconnection approval date is in the past. And all of these upload fields populate on step 5 based on what you've entered in the application. So if you think you're seeing a required upload field that doesn't apply to you, make sure you go back in the application and check what you've entered, because that's the reason that these document upload sections are being marked as required. There also on step 5 will be a section for optional uploads and just any comments that the approved vendor wants to make on the application. So anything you think the program administrator should know before they review the application, there'll be a free text box there for you to type comments. And then I think there's 5 spots for optional uploads that you can upload on this step of the application. So once the application is complete, you can click Save and Submit. You'll see this congratulations screen, and then you'll know you've successfully completed part 1 of your application. Once you've completed your application, you can go back to your project dashboard to complete additional applications or to view the status of that application. So once you're on your project dashboard, you'll see a dashboard of all your applications that are in progress or submitted. And so what you'll see once you first submit the application is the status that your application is pending submission in a batch. So once you have 100 kilowatts in project applications, you can submit your projects into a batch, and batches can be anywhere between 100 kilowatts up to 2 megawatts in size. So the way that you'll select those applications for the batch is there's the last column on the right is the batch column. You'll be able to select different projects and then click the Create Batch button. The batch submission page will automatically calculate your application fee. So that will be calculated for you here. It'll also show you the total batch size, and it'll list all the applications that are included in that batch. If you need to edit a batch, you can click the Edit Batch button, which will allow you to remove projects from that batch or add projects to that batch in case you made a mistake in the initial batch process. So to submit your batch, you must submit payment for your application fee. So to do that, you just need to select on the bottom which method you will use to submit your application fee. So you can either pay by check, by ACH, by wire, by credit card. Obviously, just by clicking those buttons doesn't automatically make the payment go through, but by clicking those buttons, you're indicating to the program administrator how you're going to pay for that batch, and then you'll need to remit payment. So once you've selected how you are going to pay your application fee, a unique tracking code will be given to you for each batch. So you'll see that here under the application IDs of the batches. And so once you've indicated that and clicked the button, your batch will be submitted, and then the program administrator will just be waiting for payment. So we'll be tracking those payments with your unique tracking code. So please be sure to include that on any payments that you're submitting so that we can match up your application fee payments to your batch submissions. We've gotten a lot of questions about the program administrator's payment information. So all approved vendors will have access to that information. You actually already do have access to that information, and that's on your vendors tab under number 5. You can click on that. You can view the program administrator's payment information and also download a copy of our W-9. So once you've gone through that batch submission process and indicated how you're going to pay, your batch submission will be in the pending batch payment status. And then that will change to batch paid once the program administrator marks you as paid once we've received your application fee. And so in order for your submitted batch of projects to be considered for the potential Block 1 lottery, your application fee payment needs to be initiated prior to the close time of 12 p.m. Central Time on February 13th, 2019. So the next steps, once you've submitted your batch, we've received the payment and marked it as paid, is that the program administrator will review and approve individual applications in the batch. Approved vendors will be given up to 2 weeks to cure any deficiencies in the applications once you've been notified by the program administrator. And if less than 75% of the volume of the batch is approved, then the batch will be rejected in its entirety. But systems that were already reviewed and approved in that batch can be submitted in another batch, which will be subject to an expedited review by the program administrator. Again, I think I've already said this a few times, but all batches submitted prior to noon on February 13th, 2019 will be considered for a Block 1 lottery. So that's the deadline when you need to have your batches submitted by. And the lottery procedures can be found on the Illinois ABP website. We're not going to go over them again here, but they are under the resources tab, and then lottery, you can find the final opening lottery procedures for the adjustable block program. Okay, so Kevin is going to take over the question and answer session. So feel free to ask any questions if you haven't typed them into the chat already.
Okay, I'm going to start at the top of the questions here. Please feel free, if I have not answered a question, to go ahead and let me know. And when we get to it at the bottom, I will attempt to re-answer. First question is if a copy of the presentation will be available, and the answer is yes, it will be posted to the website, both the PowerPoint and the actual copy of the webinar itself, the recording of the webinar itself, for those who would like to listen to it later. Will an address without a street number be acceptable for submission? What we need to determine is the parcel that your project is on, because there can only be one application per parcel. So if there legitimately isn't a street number because it's a rural address, if you can just convey to us in the notes section at the end of your application exactly which parcel it is that you're on, that will be helpful to us. The one caveat here is that the PV Watts estimate may not give you an accurate estimate if we don't have a valid street address for that. And in that case, you would need to go to PV Watts separately via just the NREL address where PV Watts lives if you would like to use a PV Watts estimate, and then enter that as a custom capacity factor, because the automatic calculation that's done by the portal would potentially not be accurate there. You'd at least want to double check it. We did mute all participants. Hopefully it's quieter for everyone here. Apologize for that. Will bulk uploads be available? We're working on that. We may not have that ready by tomorrow, but it's definitely in progress as we speak. Do the disclosure forms need to be completed and signed? Yes, they do. The only way for you to enter an application for a project that requires a disclosure form is to have a completed and signed disclosure form. That's how the applications pop up on your dashboard. So you can't start an application until that's done, and that actually pre-populates the beginning of your application with the data from the disclosure form. The exception to that is community solar projects, which don't require a project level disclosure form. And so you will be able to initiate those right from your project dashboard. Are GPS coordinates adequate for sites that don't have an address? Again, the caveat that I spoke to earlier, that the automatic PV Watts estimate may not be accurate if you do that. However, if there is no address and that's the closest thing you can give us, then that would be fine to put that in. Just put a note again on the last page. We kind of have that catch-all notes section for you to alert us to anything that we need to know. Just let us know that you used a GPS address there, and that helps us be able to correlate that when we're doing application reviews. Will applications be prioritized or deprioritized based on whether they have a known system installer? In general, there's no prioritization at all of applications, and certainly the known system installer is not a method we use to sort applications in any way. Ground coverage ratio wasn't included in the guidebook. Can more information be provided on how this should be calculated for rooftop projects? We had several people request that we add the custom advanced factors for PV Watts in the portal, which would allow them to enter custom parameters for that. If you're not using the PV Watts estimate, then what you enter for the ground coverage ratio won't matter to you anyways, because it's just used to make that PV Watts calculation for you on the SREC delivery section of the application. If you don't have a ground coverage ratio, you can just leave the default in there. That's what would be there anyways if you were to go to the PV Watts website and do the entry and not click on the advanced features section. It would use that default. So if you don't know what to use, you can just leave the default, which is pre-populated there for you. And if you go to the PV Watts website, you can find more information about exactly what ground coverage ratio is there if you would like to attempt to calculate it for your specific project. And again, if you're using the standard capacity factor or a custom capacity factor, then it doesn't really matter what you enter there, because all that is doing is populating that PV Watts section of that dropdown. Does the number of orientations mean each project on example of one parcel with multiple meters? The answer to that is yes, that we do need to have, if you have multiple projects on one parcel, they have to be entered as one application to start with. The only exception to that is if you have a co-located community solar project that meets the definition of co-location in the plan and the guidebook. But in general, if you have distributed generation projects and you have either multiple orientations, or even if you have multiple projects on the same parcel, even if they're large projects, for example, you may have a college that has 5 buildings that are all on the same parcel, each has their own rooftop system with a separate interconnection. We would want you to enter that as one application if they're on the same parcel, and just enter each of those as its own orientation. So if each of those had one orientation, then you would enter 5 arrays in that case and provide the details for each array. And it's also possible, for example, to have a home with 5 or 6 or 7 different orientations, just because you have different pitches of the roof in different locations where you place the panels. You would also do that in that case. The next question is the disclosure for large PPA requested customer info. The customer info is pre-populated in the application as the owner info. For PPAs, the customer is not the owner. Will this be the issue for applications? We'll double check that. I believe that it should be populating the owner info, and if it is not, then we'll attempt to get that fixed before tomorrow. Can you give an example of how ABP would calculate the capacity factor from an example system? There's basically 3 different ways that you can enter information into the website in order to determine how many SRECs you promise to deliver under the contract. The first way is to use the standard capacity factor. There are limits on that. Your system has to meet certain azimuth tilt requirements and shading requirements in order to use those capacity factors. However, if you do qualify to use those factors, the number that will be calculated for you is pre-calculated in the portal, and it's calculated in the background simply by multiplying the size of your system in megawatts times 365 times 24, so the number of hours in a year, times the years of the contract, 15 years, times the capacity factor, so the fixed or the tracking capacity factor, and that gives you the total number of RECs. That standard capacity factor takes into account the 0.5% per year degradation factor. If you enter a custom capacity factor, you also would need to take that 0.5% into effect. You can either do that by doing your own spreadsheet calculation, where you enter your first year production and then enter a 0.5% degradation each year and reverse engineer to get the average capacity factor over 15 years. Or there's that small calculator on the right-hand side where you enter your first year production and we'll tell you the capacity factor that you need to enter in to match that. And then the third method that you can use is the built-in PV watts calculator. In that case, it's also doing that calculation for you. It's taking all the data you provided on the previous page, the azimuth, the tilt, the coverage factor, the tracking type, and running that into PV watts, and then coming back with PV watts answer, and then it will then automatically calculate that 0.5% degradation from there. So those are all methods for you to obtain the total number of RECs that you will be delivering, and that's at the end of the day what we all care about. Will an API be developed and made available for application uploads? That also is under development. We'll let you know when it's ready. Will projects be prioritized or deprioritized based on the response to the proposed subscriber model field? Again, we have no prioritization or deprioritization based on that field or any other, except for according to the plan and the program guidebook for community solar projects, there is an initial lottery held for systems that commit to over 50% of their capacity being for small subscribers, and that's in the lottery procedures section of the guidebook. We'd recommend you read through that, but otherwise there's no prioritization given on to systems based on their answers to any given questions. For jurisdictions that don't require any permitting, is it acceptable to just put a 0 in the non-ministerial permits tab, or will we have to prove this in some other way? it is acceptable to simply put a 0, and then you won't have to provide any information at that point. We won't require you to prove it. If there's some question about that, we might come back and ask you, but in general, no, there's no requirement that you always provide us some kind of proof that no permits are required. What documents are needed to show proof of site control? Is it a specific form? There is no specific form. We do need a binding option lease or some other kind of binding evidence proof of site control. If you have a question about if what you're providing meets that requirement, you can certainly email what you've got to us and we'll let you know. A couple of comments on that. We don't need to know the actual data of your site control, so you can redact the numbers for how much the lease is or what you paid for the option or anything that has to do with the finances of that. We're not interested in that, so we don't necessarily need to see that. If you want to take it, redact it or take it off, that's fine for us. We do need to see the parties to the agreement and the address just to make sure that it's valid. And the second point is that it does need to be a binding site control. So a letter of intent or something less binding is not going to meet the requirements for that. Is the interconnection approval date, this is not the agreement date with the utility, correct? Our expected date that will be energized by the utilities. Are we able to change the utility if they have a backlog and can't meet that date, or do we need to try to get a schedule out of the utility, which would be difficult? I agree that would be difficult and it's not required. Your date that you expect to have your system energized is simply your best guess and we won't hold you to it in any way. The interconnection approval date that we ask for after your system has been approved and you do have an interconnection approval does have to be the exact date that the utility issued your interconnection approval, but that's only required after you have that. For systems over 25 kilowatts, is there a way to state that you have assigned a letter with the utility, but you are not interconnected and as a result do not have a net energy metering agreement or a COC? So I think the question here may be based on a misconception that you have to provide the interconnection approval if you're not yet interconnected. I'll try and hit this in 3 different ways. So the first is that for systems below 25 kilowatts, there isn't a requirement that you sign an interconnection approval before your system is energized. You do have to provide that for systems over 25 kilowatts. That's just saying that you're approved to build the system. There's a separate requirement for systems that indicate that they have already been interconnected. And if you select that on the application, then you'll be required to provide your interconnection agreement. And if you have one, your net energy metering agreement. If you put a date in the future for your interconnection date and not one that's today or in the past, then you will not be prompted for those items and you would not have to provide them. If I didn't answer that question, then try and ask it again and let me know what I missed there. How detailed does the explanation of the other capacity factor need to be? If you obtain that other capacity factor through another set of software, then, and it's a reasonable capacity factor, you can simply say that it was obtained using PVSYST or whatever the system is that you used, and that's sufficient for us. If we have questions on that, we'll just come back via email one-on-one and ask for a more detailed explanation. If you have something that's a very out of the ordinary system. So for example, maybe you had a very high DC to AC ratio and you had some super efficient trackers, or you have bifacial panels or something else that's a little bit strange or unusual, we might call you up or send you an email and just ask for more details on that, just so that we understand what's behind that. What if we don't know the expected interconnection date for the projects which are not energized yet? Again, just provide your best bet there. That's just to give us a really rough look ahead at what anticipated energization dates are for budget purposes and other purposes internal to the agency. And we won't hold you to those dates. And if they're not accurate or you're just putting a guess there, that's fine. We're not going to be concerned about that. Approved interconnection can be entered as a future date, but a signed interconnect document is a required upload. Can an issued but unexecuted interconnection agreement satisfy the requirements of a Part 1 application? Again, if you're seeing a requirement that you enter a an executed interconnection agreement, meaning that your system is completed and you haven't put today's date or a previous date as the interconnection date, then there's an issue that we need to fix there. So if you've actually experienced that, then please send us a screenshot of that. If otherwise, though, again, to clarify that there's the two interconnections, if you're above 25 kilowatts, you would have to provide your initial interconnection approval. And that would be what we were looking for. That's what's required for those systems. If you're under 25 kilowatts, that's not required. And you only need to provide the signed, executed, finalized interconnection agreement if your system actually is energized and interconnected. Can you pay for multiple batches at once? That's a good question. You don't necessarily have to send every payment in with every payment code. So if you submit 20 batches and you want to just send us one wire for that entire amount, or one ACH or one check, that's fine. You do need to write down all of those codes though and send us an email telling us that you submitted a ACH and you use this code or this tracking number, or something we can track that ACH, and it applies to the following systems, and then list all those systems for us so that we can match those. So at the end of the day, all we have to do is be able to go to the three payment methods and find your payment and apply it at the right place. So any way that you can get that information to us will allow us to do that. It's not important to us that you necessarily send us 17 wires because you had 17 batches. You can certainly just send one wire and then later tell us which batches, that wire covers. Will credit card payments from a credit card holder outside the US be acceptable, and is there a fee to use credit cards? There is a fee which is built into the credit card payment. It's 2.9%, such that the 2.9% fee leaves us with the full application fee once it's been paid. That's automatically computed. The credit card payments from outside the US should work fine. If you have a problem trying to do the credit card payment, if you think you might have a problem and that may be an issue, then if you can try and get one in early, and we can work with the credit card provider to get that through. It may require an additional step for us to do a secondary clearance on that. And so if it doesn't work for you, then again, email us and we'll work with you to get that done. The question that says, can we submit as 2 batches? I'm not exactly sure what the question was there. You certainly can, given the minimum batch size, submit it as many batches as you would like. So you are just subject to that minimum batch size, which depends on whether you're a normal proof vendor or you're the first batch for a small business, women or minority owned business, approved vendor. But other than that, it's up to you to determine what batch sizes you want. Keep in mind, if you read carefully through the contract, there are things that are based on the batch, such as contract assignment. So it may be in your best interest to submit batches based on that, those contract details, but I'll leave that to you to read the contract. The contract is posted on the IllinoisABP.com website. How much time with the program administrator need to process a check payment? What's the cutoff to get the check to be considered for block 1? As long as you have sent the payments for wires and ACHs by the last day, then you're good to go. For the checks, as long as the check arrived there at that day, then you'll be good to go. It's a lockbox system for the checks. It's based in Chicago. And in general, PNC processes those checks the day they get them. So it's an automated system to do that. We will do our best to get your system into the program. So if the check got there and they took an extra day to cash it, we aren't going to hold that against you and kick you out of the program because of that. So in general, if you can show us that the effort was made and the check actually got there on that day, then you'll be good to go. If you submitted your ACH or your wire on Friday and it doesn't actually hit our account until Monday or Tuesday the next week, if you can show us that you submitted that on Wednesday and it doesn't hit until Thursday or Friday, the close date, then we will accept that. So the only thing we won't accept is you saying, well, we're going to put the check in the mail and we have to wait for it. Obviously that's not going to work. So we need some kind of indication that you actually submitted that before the noon cutoff on Wednesday. The government indicated that payments made by credit card and ACH withdrawal will be considered paid immediately. Is that the case, or is the credit card the only payment method that's considered paid on submission? The credit card is the only one that will relatively immediately hit, because the ACH might have a delay before it gives us the information. However, again, as long as you initiated that by the close of the auction period, we will credit you for that. So you should be good. You should be okay. The submission of new projects end at noon and the funding has to be done by noon. You need to be done prior to noon to close out any batches, or is that missing something? So the answer is that you need to have initiated your funding by noon again. So if you can show that you initiated the wire by noon, or you initiated an ACH, then there's some time for us to close that out afterwards. Can you provide information on the rec true-up process? I'm not sure if this is a question about the contractor. This is a question about us checking applications and getting back to you. We're not going to talk about the contract in this forum. And so if you have a question on that, you can reach out to us separately on it. If you're talking about us checking applications and getting back to you, there's a several week period after the application, after the lottery window closes, for us to review applications and then for us to ask you to provide information that we might need. That will happen on a rolling basis. And again, our intention is not to exclude anyone through some bureaucratic process from the lottery. So to the extent that we're both working in a good faith effort to provide the information, for us to get the information from you and for you to provide the information to us, even if that requires us to go back and forth 2 or 3 times between what you provide us and what we need, we will get that information from you and get your application in. So our intent there is to get everyone into the process who submitted their application on time. And that may require a few emails or phone calls or communication back and forth between us to get that, but we will make sure that gets done. This isn't our first rodeo of doing this. We've done this in a number of different cases for many years in many jurisdictions. So we do our best to work with you to get the information that we need. That's the goal at the end of the day. Next question is about uploading marketing materials and asking whether that's required in order to submit projects. That would only be required if we ask you for it specially. So if we have specifically requested you upload marketing materials, then you would need to do that. If we have not, and you're an approved vendor, then you're good to go. You don't need to do anything with that. Can 2 community solar adjacent projects be submitted on the same parcel? They can be. Those would be called co-located projects. There are specific rules about co-located projects in the plan and in the project guidebook and in the lottery procedures. There may be an issue with on the demo site with you submitting 2 adjacent projects, but that will be fixed on the live site when it goes live tomorrow. Question about combined roof and ground applications, and how do you handle it when there's a combined roof and a ground system? And if you can't enter it separately, but you can't enter them at the same time either. That's kind of an edge case that's not accounted for in the standard application flow. If you have projects on a parcel, they do need to be submitted as one project. And so even if it's a combination of roof and ground mount projects, they do need to be submitted as one project. If you do have, for example, you had one roof and one ground mount, you could enter those as 2 separate arrays and then enter in either one, roof or ground, and then just provide again in the last page that explanation that the first one is actually a ground mount, and that will be fine. The only issue you may run into is if you're combining different types of tracking on one project, that the PV watts estimate might not be accurate for you, in which case you would need to use a custom capacity factor in that case, which could be PV watts, but you just have to go and do the entries yourself on the NREL PV watts website to get the answer for that. If you have some situation like that that's a little bit odd and you're not sure how to handle it, then let us know and we will make sure that it goes in correctly. The interconnection date of later than June 1, 2017 is now set as a requirement. So how do we define energization? That's actually been a requirement from the beginning of the plan. And energization is your interconnection approval, the date on your interconnection approval from the utility. Will additional uploads be required for systems less than 25 kW? In the guidebook, it mentions that systems over 25 kW require additional uploads of interconnection agreements and proof of permits. The application is set up to only ask you for the things that are required for your system. And so if you put in an application on the demo site, you'll see this as well, and you'll see it tomorrow on the live site. If you put in an application that's less than 25 kW, it won't ask you for the interconnection agreement and proof of permits. If your system's over that, it will ask you. So those are the items that are required. And there's other items that are required depending on the permutation of your system. In the program guidebook, it lists what all those details are, and that's all implemented in the software. So you don't necessarily have to read the program guidebook. You can just start your application and it will ask you for everything that's needed. Question is, I have a system that is 10,500 kilowatt hours. What happens to the 500? Is it rounded up or down? If you're talking about the number of kilowatt hours you're going to produce over the 15 years, it is we described that math earlier to come up with the 15-year number, and the very last number is going to be rounded down in all cases to the nearest megawatt hour, which is the minimum size of a REC, because it's not possible for you to produce a partial REC, and the contract is worded in order to state that. So if you read through the contract, you'll see that. This question about, you said there can only be one application per parcel. What about co-located projects? Again, the one application per parcel is specific to distributed generation, large and small systems. For co-located projects, that only applies to community solar projects, and you will be able to indicate for community solar projects that you are entering a co-located project. Again, that on the demo site is not working like it will on the live site. So a caveat there. The certificate of completion of interconnection upload is in the required documents section. Why are we asked for this when the majority of applicants won't have it? When we upload something or we can't proceed to the next step. Again, you won't be asked for that if you put your completion date as some date in the future. So that's only happening because you stated that your completion date was today or some day prior to today. If again, if you're not seeing that, then please send us a screenshot and we'll make sure that gets fixed. But we've had that question from a number of people, and we've done a number of test cases and not been able to reproduce it. So again, if there is an actual bug, we do want to know about it. So please send us a screenshot if you're seeing that with a date in the future. There's a question, a specific question that I will answer offline directly about 25 kilowatt systems that are aggregated together. Will bulk uploads be available in the next 2-week window? It's going to be hard to keep clean data with 50 fields individually copied and pasted. I feel your pain. We are working very hard on that and doing our very best to get that done. I would say to check with us on Friday, and we can tell you what the chances are that that will be done before the 2-week window is complete. I will note also that we are going to have a dashboard available on the public portion of the website, which will allow you to see what the application queue is for each block. And that should let you know, for example, if you need to worry about a lottery being held in the small DG ComEd territory, block 1, if that's where your applications are. So again, that's not perfect, but that should give you at least some idea as to what the application flow is. If we complete and submit a part 1, but need to edit it before we assign it to a batch, what is the process for that? There's, in general, you would need to tell us if you need to make a change, and we would make that change for you. Is there any other method available for document upload? It's time consuming for uploading documents in bulk, and the other method is an API, and that's, we are working on it. What is the impact in the application process if a project does not meet the minimal shading criteria? The minimal shading criteria is really only there to determine whether you're allowed to use the standard capacity factors. If your project doesn't meet the minimal shading criteria, then you need to either use the PV watts calculation or you need to use a custom capacity factor. And it's up to you to determine what the best solution is. Keep in mind that you're the one that has to deliver these RECs over the 15-year contract term. And so it's incumbent on you to make sure that you actually can meet those. So you really have an incentive not to say that you'll create too many RECs, but then again, you obviously don't want to lose out on revenue because all of the RECs need to be delivered to the utilities. So do your best to do an accurate estimate there. And if it's not accurate, there's a process in place via the contract to true up the collateral amounts in order to account for that. If projects have been purchased from other developers, is additional documentation needed? Can they require the utility QID supplied by ComEd and Ameren as a required field? I think that's two different questions. So the first question is, if projects have been purchased from other developers, is additional documentation needed? I would say that whoever the owner is, as long as you're the owner and you're putting the application in, or you're the approved vendor and have the permission of the owner to put the application in, then that's all that's required from the point of the program. If there's some specific concern there that I'm missing, then please specify that in a follow-up to the question. The utility QID, that's actually a last-minute add that we're making right now, so that will be in as an optional item in the application that is released tomorrow. So it will be possible for large DG and community solar projects to enter that utility QID, and it will be optional, however. So if you do not want to enter it, you do not have to enter it. Is there an ability to download data from the portal? For example, systems included in a batch and batch ID or standard disclosure form IDs. We're talking about that internally right now. And so if you have some input on what you want that to look like, then send us an email about what you want it to look like. Can installers be changed later on? They can. You would just have to, on part 2 of the application, provide that information with the new installer, the final installer that you actually used. On the disclosure form, we enter the customer address, not the site address. They're not always the same. Should we enter the site address for all projects? The customer address and site address are not the same. It's going to auto-populate the customer address. So the customer address, I guess the question is, we need the site address is the bottom line. And I'm not sure, I would have to go back through on a disclosure form. So maybe you can send that separately to us as an email. But if we're not ending up with the site address on a part 1 application, if you're doing a demo and you're not seeing the site address in the part 1 application, then that's a problem. So I believe that it's, yeah. Okay. Yeah, if you can send us an email and we'll answer that specifically offline with you. If there's a single address with 3 meters and 3 different 10 kilowatt inverters going to each meter, are they treated in category 1 or 2? I believe the question was probably more specified towards, are they a below 10 kilowatt DG system or above 10 kilowatt DG system? And if so, what adder do they fall into with that REC pricing? The answer to that is generally, if you have multiple systems on a parcel, they're all added together, and that determines which block they are in, whether they're a large or small DG, and what adder they have for the large DG. There is an exception to that if you actually have separate owners. And so, for example, if you had an office building and the individual offices were separately owned by individual owners and they were on one parcel, and each office decided separately to put up their own solar array, and they had different meters and different inverters, they could enter 3 different applications in that case, and they would be counted based on their size. However, if the office building itself put up 3 different systems and they were the owner of all of them, then that would not count. We have a detailed section on that in the guidebook, and so if you have questions specific to your situation, then let us know. For projects that were energized prior to the program being developed, if the customer refuses to sign a disclosure form, how should a developer get an application created? If that happens, you'll just need to contact us separately and let us know which application, which disclosure form it is, and we will change it to a signed status and put a note on it that you made what's called a good faith effort to get the disclosure form signed, and then you'll be able to create your application. The disclosure form does in all cases, however, have to at least be created in order for us to do that. And obviously for you to make a good faith effort, you would have had to create the disclosure form. If you have one DG array and one community solar array on the same parcel, are those two separate applications? The answer to that is generally yes, but if you have a specific case where you're doing that, it might be worth running it by us to make sure that we can make sure that they're entered correctly. The answer to that might not be, there might be some caveats to that we might have to talk about. So it might be worth talking to us about that first. Inverter size and AC watts is the total AC system size. Is that correct? That is correct. The only caveat to that, I think, is in the guidebook about microinverters with, if you have an AC system like a microinverter that can have two panels and you only have one panel connected, then you wouldn't count the capacity of that second side, which is in no way connected to the AC, to the inverter. But that's a very niche issue. In general, this program does use the AC size as the size when making all of the determinations about what your which block you're in and what your adders are for your payments. That's all based on AC size. How do we handle different planes for rooftops? If you have multiple projects, can we just put in a placeholder and address the total rec quantities outside the portal? If you do have an issue where you have maybe a parcel with a bunch of different buildings on it and each of them has several different arrays, and it would turn into, you're going to have 20 or more different arrays, it is possible for you to just put in a number that gives you the correct final number in the portal. So you could just put in one array with the correct total size, and then you could separately send us a spreadsheet that lists all of your arrays. But please only do that if there are more arrays on your project than we give you spots for in the portal. So that would be a very few cases. The person who asked the question is one of those cases, and there may be a couple of others. Will approved vendors be allowed to Freedom of Information Act all applications? How often will accepted submissions be updated? There is a checkbox for both Part 1 and Part 2 for an approved vendor to designate the system to be commercially sensitive information, I believe is the term. I may not have that wording exactly right, but it's one of the exemptions that allows the IEPA to not release information under Freedom of Information Act, and you have the option to check that box for every application. And if you do, the IEPA will endeavor to protect your information under the Freedom of Information Act under that clause. There is no guarantee that they'll be successful in protecting your information, because the Freedom of Information Act obviously is beyond them. It could actually go to a judge, and a judge could compel them to release that information. However, they have committed to requesting, if you would like to have your information protected, that they will assert that Freedom of Information Act clause if you have indeed made that selection. How often will the accepted submissions be updated? I'm not sure if the question here is on the dashboard. That will be updated once a day. And how often will we actually be reviewing accepted submissions? Once you submit a batch, we are basically reviewing those on an ongoing basis. So someone's asking, in step 3, we're asking if we meet the minimal shading criteria, but for residential customers, it might not be possible. So if they say no, does it make a difference? So it does make a difference, because if you say no, then on the next page, you won't be given the option to use the standard capacity factor, because the standard capacity factor requires that you meet the minimum shading criteria. So you can certainly proceed and submit an application, and you'll be fine if you don't meet the minimum shading criteria. It's solely there to determine whether you can use those two standard capacity factors, one for fixed and one for tracking systems. If we're using the same custom capacity factor that is lower than the standard on a majority of our applications, can we submit a general application, or will be required to provide an explanation on each application? Keep in mind that we have multiple people who are reviewing applications, and so we would need to have some way that we could tie back. But if you want to provide a very detailed explanation on your first application, and then on subsequent applications say that the application is the same as the application would provide that detailed information, that would be fine. Or you can just paste in the standard spiel that you have for your custom capacity factor. Again, the custom capacity factors, if it's not something that's dramatically out of the ordinary, and you provide an explanation of what system you use to come up with it, will be accepted. What will qualify as non-ministerial permits? Are federal permits considered non-ministerial? We could spend several hours talking about that. We have a FAQ on the website that has very carefully worded definition of what a non-ministerial permit is, and it is in the commercially reasonable discretion of the approved vendor to determine if a given permit is considered a non-ministerial permit or not. And I would request that you read that FAQ or read that section of the guidebook, which also has that same language in it. So if you just do a search in the guidebook for non-ministerial permits, that's a very carefully crafted paragraph and sentence that describes what those are. We are not going to be going to extreme lengths to go visit your site and give you a gotcha because there was some non-ministerial permit for some obscure thing that you didn't have. It's really a requirement that you provide that. We will be doing spot checks on those. And if it becomes an issue because there was a permit you didn't have, then it may impact your ability to claim force majeure and get your performance guarantee back. If you don't complete your project, it may, if you've done this a bunch of times, impact your ability to continue as an approved vendor. But it's definitely not a gotcha issue that we are going to be actually doing site visits on a site-by-site basis to check non-ministerial permits. What is a shading study? Who can perform it to qualify for the submission? Shading studies can be done by any of a number of shading study software packages. A professional engineer can do a shading study. Someone who's experienced in doing shading studies can do them. We will just need to see that a reasonable shading study has been done. If you have a question about whether yours is reasonable, let us know. But there's wide latitude and wide discretion on that. And again, we're not going to be the shading study police on that, as long as you can provide a reasonable shading study that shows the actual items that are shading the array, and you have a reasonable accommodations for that in your production estimates. The real factor that's keeping you and us and everyone in the program honest here is the fact that you are committing via contract to deliver these recs. So it's in everyone's best interest for you to do an accurate shading study so that the number of recs that you're paid for are the number of recs that you deliver, and we don't have to deal with contract drawdowns and true ups and everything else with the contract if there is a shortfall of recs. Please explain irrevocable permit. I'm not sure where that language comes from. Yeah, maybe if it's an irrevocable transfer order that you're referring to, the registries have what's called an irrevocable transfer order. And what that is a system whereby you designate that all of the recs or some percentage of the recs for community solar projects that aren't fully subscribed will go to the counterparty, which will be the utility with which you signed a contract for that project. And that must be signed before the payment can be made to you. If you have a question about that, I would recommend contacting PJM GATS or MRETS, if that's the registry you're going to use, and they can certainly explain how that works. If checks are delivered after 2/13 at 12 p.m., are those applications rejected? Again, if you can demonstrate that you began you sent those and they were on their way prior to the close at 12 p.m., then we will accept them, so that we will give a couple days afterwards to receive those. What's the best way to address issues and errors uploading systems and information to the portal? Should we email admin at ABP? or is there another developer email address we should use? You can just send any questions you have to the admin at illinoisabp.com. And we have the whole team is answering those emails. So that's the best place to send those. PPAs that are contingent on receiving REC contracts have customers who are reluctant to sign a lease in absence of a contract. Letter of intent to develop a project was stated as not acceptable earlier. Would a signed document stating intent to lease property in conjunction with a future project be acceptable? The bottom line answer to that is no. You would have to have some kind of a binding agreement to lease the project, or lease the property, or have an option to lease the property. It could certainly be an option, which is only exercised in the case of receiving a REC contract. It could be a binding, again, I would say it could be a contingent lease, which is contingent on the project. Is there a way to submit projects with a DC-AC ratio over 1.5, which are supposed to be approved on a case-by-case basis? It appears the test system rejects DC to AC over 1.5. You certainly can submit that. Because this program is somewhat unique in designating which tier you're in based on your AC capacity rather than DC, as most other programs we're all familiar with use. There is certainly the temptation and the option for applicants to game the system by overwhelming the DC to AC ratio and basically putting a small AC system on so that you qualify for something like the under 10 kilowatts, which is a higher per REC price, and then putting a whole bunch of DC panels behind it so that you get to sell a whole bunch of RECs under that program. So if you have a good reason why you're having a ratio over 1.5, then we're happy to hear that by email. You can send that to us. But again, this isn't our first rodeo. We've reviewed literally tens of thousands, collectively 100,000 solar arrays over in the US and Canada over the last 10 years. And we don't see a lot of systems with a ratio greater than 1.5. So it would have to be some reason beyond just producing more power and using a smaller AC system to get that to higher REC price. Do we have to put the unique tracking code on each check? Back to the answer earlier on that, if you would like to send one check and have it cover multiple systems, then you can just put one tracking code and then send us an email with a spreadsheet that contains the rest of the systems that are tied to that check. However, if you do send a check for each system, then we would like the tracking code on that check. Otherwise, it will be virtually impossible for us to match them to the correct system. If you're a community solar only approved vendor, and so we skip step 3 as directed, is there any risk that we are waiving a future potential to function as something other than a community solar approved vendor? So the answer to that is that if you would like to be something other than a community solar approved vendor later, or even tomorrow, or later today, then you could just ask us to change your status, and you could provide us that information, and we can change you to a regular approved vendor. So you can certainly change to a general approved vendor at any point by simply providing us the additional information that you didn't provide earlier. You're not locked into whatever you initially signed up as, but you would have to provide that information that was not provided earlier in order to obtain that general approved vendor category. For systems that are larger than 25 kW, can you provide a bit more detail about what you're looking for in a certificate of completion of interconnection field, specifically in the case of a system not yet being interconnected? Again, the certificate of completion of interconnection field will only show up if you put a date in that was prior to today, or prior to today, on the application. And so if it's above 25 kW, you should see a interconnection requirement that you upload your interconnection approval, which is your initial interconnection approval. But the certificate of completion interconnection field will not come up as a requirement unless you specify that your system was interconnected today or earlier, today being whatever day you're doing the application. And again, if you're seeing that and there's an error there, then give us a screenshot so we can track it down. Can you give us the final approved definition of non-ministerial permits and the methodology by which either UNCLIM or IPA will definitively determine which non-ministerial permits are required for a given project outside the statements of the applicant? The answer is that we really can't. I can give you the definition that's in the guidebook, and that is the definition. The definition in the guidebook leaves it up to the commercially reasonable discretion of the approved vendor. And so if you as the approved vendor in your commercially reasonable discretion determine that it is not a non-ministerial permit, then it would not be a non-ministerial permit. We are not able to, nor are we willing to, go out to all of your sites and do an analysis of what the non-ministerial permits are that would be required on that site. We neither have the time nor the capability nor the expertise to do that. That is, you as approved vendors have that expertise, or developers who are reporting to an approved vendor, and so that's up to you to do. Again, this is not going to be a gotcha item that IPA or Incline will be using to try and disqualify systems. And in fact, it's not our intention to disqualify systems at all that are operating within the program rules. Will the program admin begin reviewing Part 1 applications prior to 213? Yes, we will. As soon as batches are submitted, we will start matching the batch payments to the batches so that you know that those batches were accepted. And then once a batch has been accepted by us, we will immediately begin reviewing them. And so you may very well hear from us starting tomorrow. If you don't hear from us starting tomorrow, it's probably because we received 5,000 applications tomorrow, and yours is in the list. We will get to you, but we are going to start reviewing them right away. As we create and submit batches, is there a place we can view a summary of all batches in the portal? You can certainly see which projects have been submitted as part of a batch. I don't think the portal right now shows a summary of your batches. If that's a feature that you would want, I would say to send that to us as a request, and we'll put it on the list of things that we do. Something like that would be after something like the API, which is a high priority item, but it's probably something that's not terribly difficult to make happen either. So we depend on you guys to let us know if there's features that you need to do your job. So let us know if that's the case, and we can't promise that we'll do it, but we'll certainly give it consideration. And if it's possible, we'll certainly put it on our list of things to do. And it may not get done tomorrow, but it will get done. It's still unclear how one should deduce a custom capacity factor from a modeling tool like PVSYST. PVSYST generates a specific yield. How does the ABP expect a developer to calculate the custom capacity factor from PVSYST? The easy answer to that is that PVSYST will give you the output in megawatt hours, or in kilowatt hours the first year for that system. Plug that into the little tool on the right-hand side of that step on the application form, and it will spit out a custom capacity factor, and then you can just put that custom capacity factor in. That's the easiest way to accomplish that. Is the interconnection certification and the net metering authorization the same for Ameren or any utility? That's a great question, and they're not. They're two separate things. So the interconnection certification, again, there's two types of interconnection certification. One is for systems above 25 kilowatts that you need initial interconnection approval before you build your system. And then for all systems, there's a certificate of completion or permission to operate or a final interconnection approval, has various names, but that's from the utility, signed by the utility saying, and when I say utility, the wire provider, the EDC, Ameren, ComEd, Mid-American, or your Muni or Co-op, or Mount Carmel, that is the interconnection, final interconnection approval, and that is also required on completion of your system. The net metering authorization is a separate document, and it is an optional upload, and it will actually come from your electricity supplier, which, if you're not on the standard offer service, may be different from your wires provider. So it may not be ComEd. If you're in ComEd territory, you may have a separate ARIES, it's called, competitive supplier, in which case your net metering agreement would be with them. How much can production estimates change without penalty between Part 1 and Part 2 of the application? That's part of the contract that sets that up. It's there's not necessarily a penalty. There's simply a limit by which it can change. There's an implicit penalty in that you end up with the lower of the amount that you said you were going to initially have, or what you would finally end up with, and your price is set based on the lowest potential price. So I would, we could talk for 10 minutes about that specifically. I would say to refer to the contract on that specific section. The question asking for the expected mix of residential to non-residential. Is this related to the small subscriber adders, or is there another reason for this question? So the question been, what is the mix of small and large subscribers? That question was in the original plan, and so we copied it over to the application. The perhaps the reason behind that question is it could be shared from IPA, which is not they don't have a speaking role on this call. So if you send an email to us, we can get back to you with that. I would say that we're just looking for your best guess on those, because it is an expected mix, and obviously you don't know at the time you do the application what you're going to achieve. I think that IPA, some of the data that we request on the application is used to determine how the program is going. There is a plan review process that will happen in the spring, going through the fall of this upcoming year, 2019, for the next tranche of this program. And so information like that can help the IPA and the parties to the potential filing in the ICC to determine how they'd like to proceed going forward. So that falls into that type of a question that's used for basically helping us make the program better, rather than determining whether or not we're going to qualify you for that particular question. Does a site with two 10 kilowatt systems on one parcel with separate meters require a revenue grade meter? The general idea, I believe, is that the revenue grade meters sizes are based on the registry in which you're operating, and there's a somewhat complex table in the guidebook that describes that. I don't know, I'm looking at my colleague here, Lauren, if GATS insists on a revenue grade for having 2 meters. So maybe if you have that question, you can send that separately to us, and we can figure that out. Yeah, that's kind of an edge case question. So when should we expect to hear back after February 13th? How are the projects ranked in the lottery? There's an entire chapter in the guidebook on how the lottery works. We don't have the time now to go through that. It's very detailed and in depth, and was the subject of multiple stakeholder meetings and processes. And so I would recommend you go to the guidebook for that. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through the details of that, but if you have questions on it after reading it, we're happy to answer those. And as far as hearing back on the lottery, there's in the guidebook, there's a timeline set out for the time that it will take us to review all the projects that we get. Keep in mind that depending on the number of the size of the projects in the various categories, there could easily be 25,000 projects that are that come in. If a bunch of small projects come in the large DG section, and potentially in community solar section, and just the small DG alone is many thousands of projects. So we certainly can't review those all in a day after February 13th. And so there is a timeline there that gives us time to review the projects, ask any questions that we need from you as approved vendors to get more information for certain projects, and clear those need info projects out and get them approved so that they can be in the lottery. Will the building permit for ground mount 2 megawatts come under non-ministerial permits? Building permits are not are ministerial permits. They are not non-ministerial permits, if that makes any sense. So you would not need to provide your building permit. You would need, if you had to get a zoning variance, for example, that would be considered a non-ministerial permit for a 2 megawatt project. That may be something that you would need in many counties, but not all counties. Is there a maximum threshold by which the footprint of a co-located project can be expanded between part 1 and part 2? In general, in order to prevent gaming, the rule is very firm that if you have a co-located project for community solar, which are the only projects that can be co-located, and they are on the same parcel, and one project wins and the other one does not, that you cannot simply wholesale move the winning project to the location of the non-winning project, because that's where the farmer or the developer would rather have their project. The project generally needs to remain where it was when you placed the bid. If you really wanted a project in that one section, the option available to you is to simply submit only one application for the one project that you want to build where you want to build it. And if you did just submit one project, then you could build it wherever you wanted on the parcel. So this rule only applies to co-located projects on a single parcel. We did carve out in the guidebook some specific exceptions that will allow you to move the project. For example, if the project left part of the parcel stranded and the farmer needed an access way to get their tractors and equipment through the parcel to the stranded portion of the parcel, then you could explain that to us, and a reasonable access way could be placed there, which would obviously necessitate you moving some panels from that access way into another part of the parcel. You can certainly make the parcel, you could shrink the project so that it is in the same footprint but doesn't take up the whole footprint. You could increase the project so that it was in the same, it encompassed the entire footprint that it was originally in, and then more. If the project, for example, used less efficient panels that were larger and so you needed more space, or you simply decided to give yourself more space between panels for better shading, all those are allowed. If you have something that was unanticipated that you can give us a explanation of. So for example, once you got on site, you found out that there was an underwater spring under a portion of one of the projects, and there was no way you could have known that until you started digging holes for pilings, and you explain that to us on a case-by-case basis. The IPA will evaluate whether that would allow you to move your project. So in general, if it's a legitimate reason for moving the project and you can articulate that to us, we will certainly allow it. If it appears to be a wholesale moving your project from the winning site to the non-winning site of a co-located project, then that would not be allowed. That's the much thought and effort and work on the part of stakeholders and the utilities and IPA and program administrator went into developing that to prevent gaming. Is a capacity factor required only for systems that are already energized? All systems need a capacity factor in order to determine how many RECs you will be entering into the program and how much you'll be paid. So that capacity factor can either be one of the standard capacity factors if your system is eligible. It can be the PV watts number, or it can be a custom capacity factor that you come up with through your own software. Is there any leeway between energized data and the required uploads? It usually takes at least a week, if not more, after the system is energized to get the required uploads. It's up to you to, I guess I'm not sure what the question is there, because you can do the way the system is set up is there's a part one application, which you do now. And if the project hasn't been completed, it's still in the planning stages. Once the part one application is sent into a batch, submitted, reviewed, we send it to ICC. ICC approves it. It goes to the utility, and the approved vendor and the utility sign a contract. You then have 12 months for a DG project or 18 months for a community solar project to complete that project. At the end of that time, or in any time in the meantime, when you actually finish the project, you come back to the portal and complete part two, which is where you upload your required uploads. That does not have to be done the day that the project is energized. So you could have your project finished on July 1st, and you could come on July 30th and do all those uploads and enter that information, and you would be good to go. I guess one potential issue on that question might be if you finish the project and it was energized on the 365th day, do you have to complete part two also on that 365th day? I would say no, that's not how it's written. Certainly in a reasonable amount of time after that, we'll be asking you, has your system been finished and why haven't you completed part two? But it would be in your best interest to complete it because you won't get paid until you do. So I don't see an issue with that. If I'm using a tool other than PVSys and have a first year kilowatt hour, how can I calculate capacity factor by including degradation factor? Can you provide us the formula used in calculating capacity factor, including the degradation rate. So we have the tool on the right side of the of that step of the application. And so all you have to do, no matter how you get that first year kilowatt hour rating, is put in how many kilowatt hours your system's going to make in the first year, and that tool will just spit out a capacity factor, and that's all you have to do. Should be dead simple. If there's any questions on that, it's one of those things we worked ourselves into knots, and you can certainly work yourself into knots figuring out the 0.5% per year and doing the math on that and backing into it. We did all that for you, so you can just use that calculator. So hopefully that we did that work so you don't have to. Do co-located CSG, which I'm assuming to be community solar generation projects, need separate addresses? The test portal is not letting me submit a second project. So that's a limitation of the test portal, which we're aware of and working on. So you do need to put the same address in if they are the same address, and you will be able to do that tomorrow. Is the inverter size and input intended to be total inverter output at POI? The inverter size is intended to be the max continuous or nameplate output of the inverter. And in general, although some inverter spec sheets are a little bit ambiguous about that, we're going to default to the size of the inverter as it's sold. So if you have a Sunny Boy SM-10 US or whatever the model number is, and it's a 10 kilowatt inverter, we're going to call that a 10 kilowatt inverter. If you have something in the spec sheet that says it can actually do 10.278 kilowatts, that's not really considered the nameplate size of the inverter if it's a 10 kilowatt inverter. So the nameplate size is intended to be what the nameplate of that inverter is, literally what it says on the nameplate on the inverter. So please don't try to put odd numbers there. We would generally expect, absent a microinverter, that those are, as we know with small inverters, are generally to the nearest kilowatt or half kilowatt. Can we say that average tilt and average azimuth of a tracking system is 30 and 180 for single axis? The PV watts gives you a different answer depending on what you say. I mean, obviously, depending on which azimuth is tracking, you do know one, that's going to be fixed. But for some reason, it does require an input. So if you're doing a tracking system, I would imagine you have your own custom software that you're using anyways. And I would probably say that you're best off if you have a tracking system using a custom software and a custom capacity factor. If you're not, though, I'd recommend that you read the documentation for PV watts to ensure that you're entering the right information to get the right answer out of that. Tracking systems are difficult for us to give you an estimate on, and PV watts is really designed as a tool for you as you're doing that. But if you're doing a more sophisticated system, we would anticipate you would have your own more sophisticated tools. If you expand but not wholesale move a winning co-located project into a non-winning area, is there a maximum amount of expansion allowed, i.e. 25%? There isn't a maximum amount that it's allowed, because our intention is not to approach it in that way. Our intention is that the default is that you're going to build it where you said you were going to build it. And if you're not going to build it where you said you were going to build it, you have to have a compelling reason for every deviation that you have. Clarification of the above question: if you have a co-located community solar projects on multiple contiguous parcel, but only one is selected, will the project have the ability to adjust location to accommodate the landowner's preference? Contiguous parcels are, you can move your project wherever you want on that parcel. So as long as the community solar project is on its own parcel, then you don't have to worry about any of this. This is really just for co-located projects which are on the same parcel. So as long as you're on contiguous parcels and you want to move the winning project around on the parcel that it was originally on, that's fine. The one thing you couldn't do, obviously, is move it to the parcel of the non-winning project. I'd like to be able to submit a Part 1 application for systems that are interconnected but not yet have a GATS ID or net metering agreement. The net metering agreement is an optional upload, so you don't have to worry about that. For the not having a GATS ID yet, yeah, we talked about this. We had a discussion about this earlier today. I would say that probably give us a call and we can talk about that, because it's in order to, if you're trying to avoid paying the performance guarantee up front, which is the benefit of having an already completed system, meaning that you would go right from your part 1 application and then also fill in a part 2 application, and then we could withhold your performance guarantee out of your payment rather than requiring you to post collateral up front. In order for all that to work, we have to have a GATS number. And the reason we have to have the GATS number is because you have to set up a irrevocable transfer with the utility, and the utility, we pass that information to the utility so they know to accept your irrevocable transfer, because they don't want to just accept any random irrevocable transfer request that they get, because they've been getting a bunch of random ones out of this program already, which obviously no one has been approved for any contract yet. And so that's there's some reasoning behind why we're doing that. And so if it's going to prevent you from getting into the 2-week window, and that's going to be an issue, then we may have you put in a dummy GATS number, but we'll need to know about that so that we can have you put the correct number in as soon as you get it, which we'll want you to do right away. Again, that's if you're trying to avoid paying that cash collateral up front. If you don't care about the cash collateral, then we don't, it's not nearly as big of an issue. The disclosure form does not give the option to provide a company name and point of contact. However, both are listed in the part 1 application in step 2. Can the company name be added to the disclosure form, or can we edit the information on step 2 so we can provide both? I'm not sure on this particular one. Maybe you can email that question to us and we can research it, because I would have to look at the actual applications to see what's going on there. How do you calculate capacity factor from PVSys production estimates? Under the calculator for capacity factor in the portal, when you enter year 1 production, does it automatically assume 0.5% annual degradation over a 15-year period? And yes, that's exactly what it does. So it assumes a 5.5% annual degradation over 15 years, and then comes up with the average 15-year capacity factor in order to give the number of recs that are going to be provided. And the 0.5% annual degradation rate is in the plan, and we don't have any discretion over that. I have 2 large DG projects to upload. I'm trying to decide between individual and batch uploads. Can you point out the section in the contract that I should review to help make that decision? When I was referring to that earlier, the issue is that if you plan to assign those contracts later on, you can only assign based on systems that were uploaded in the same batch. And so so it might be in your best interest, if you think you might want to assign them later, to do that. There's some other issues in the contract that may affect your situation as to how excess recs are applied to shortfalls. And if you assign one project, what happens to those excess recs? And so all of those could factor into your decision to decide whether to do an individual project or a batch. Again, the decision is entirely up to you. If a co-located project is submitted, two 2-megawatt projects, but only one project is awarded a favorable lottery spot, being block 1 through 3, and the other is placed in queue, what will our rec rate be? Is there an obligation to build the second phase in block 4 plus? So right now you have the option, if you get put in block 4, to not accept the contract, because obviously that price is not a price that you would necessarily want. So you are given an option to do that. We're working right now on an off-ramp to those who get placed into block 3. And so if you have any thoughts on that, let us know via email. So that would be someone who was in the lottery, and instead of being in the combined block 1 and 2, got put into block 3, whether they would have the option to decline a contract. For a system submitted and reviewed in the first few days of the application window, if feedback is provided right away with a 2-week deficiency cure period clock start, or would changes be allowed up until the close of the window on 2/13 and the cure period begins sometime after? Again, the purpose of the cure period is just you have to respond to us within 2 weeks of us asking you for the information. And so it's very possible that in many cases, there'll be more than one communication between us and an approved vendor on a particular project. We are not starting clocks and setting up some complex Byzantine system to track that. We really just want you to respond to us when we ask you for information, and we'll do our best to respond back to you so that we can get all the projects through the process by the time we have the lottery. And so what the cure period is really meant to do is to allow us, if we ask you for information and more than 2 weeks go by and we haven't heard anything from you at all, to not have to keep following up to get an initial response from you. But if we're making a good faith effort together to arrive at a solution to the problem, you're not held to 2 weeks to get that done. Inverter size question. The portal is seemingly not accepting nameplate size of the inverter. I would need more specifics on that question because I'm not sure what the question is. If you enter 10 kilowatts, is it not accepting the 10? I'm not sure exactly what the question is there. If an inverter allows the export to be limited at a lower level than the max inverter capacity, i.e. you could limit a 15 kilowatt inverter to 12.5 kilowatts, can a limited capacity be used as the replacement nameplate size? Why don't you send that to us via email? My initial inclination would be to say that unless you could demonstrate to us that that was permanently going to be the case, then it would be an issue. But for example, if you had a utility approved system where you had done that, so for example, the utility, it was limiting you to 10 kilowatts because there was a 10 kilowatt transformer issue on that particular transmission line that you were, distribution line that you were on, and you had an interconnection that said you were limited to 10 kilowatts and you would set your inverter up to do that, then that would probably be okay. If you were just telling us that, yes, we're going to, in software, limit the inverter to a lower rate, I would say that that would not be okay. So it would be somewhat dependent on the situation. In step 6, which is in part 2 of the application, which is meant to be completed after you've completed your project, the system asks, does your system still match the array information in part 1? If you select yes, it prompts you to step 7 through 9, which asks for interconnection online date and specific system details. We assume these steps are for energized projects, or should we be selecting no to this question? The intention is that you don't go to step 6 until your system is complete. So part 2 of the application is only for completed systems. And so when you complete part 1 and submit a batch, if your projects aren't done yet, then you're done at that point. All you need to do at that point is answer any questions that we specifically ask you. But that part 2 application is only for your project after it has been energized. Following up on batch uploads and rec assignments, where specifically is the section to review so that we can make the decisions? If a project is first through the lottery, passes all reviews, can we start working on that project without having to wait for the rest of the projects to be awarded in the lottery? So kind of 2 questions. The rec assignments and the batch uploads, what I'm referring to there is in the contract that the approved vendor signs with the utility, there are limitations on when you can assign and what you can assign out of your portfolio. And so, for example, if you had a batch, you can only assign projects that are inside of an entire product order, which consists of a batch. And so if you had wanted to split that up, you wouldn't be able to do that. You would have had to have done that initially when you submitted your project so that they ended up as different product orders. So that's in the product order section of the contract. So if you do a search, word search for product order, you'll find that in the contract. If the second part of the question is about when projects go through the lottery will all be conducted at once. So every project that submits their application inside the lottery window, we will run through all those projects, approve all of them that are approvable, and then we will hold the lottery on a single day at a single time, and all projects will find out on that day if they are a winning project in the lottery or not. The only caveat to that is that some projects may be placed on a wait list, meaning they did not win in the lottery, but they are on a ordinal numbered list, and they may end up with a contract later on because someone higher up than them dropped off of the list. If you are in a system that is a winning system in the lottery, then you certainly can start building it, and we would hope you would start building it right away. So there's no timing issues on when you find out that you have a winning system in the lottery. As soon as we work through the contract, send the contract to ICC, and you sign the contract with the utility, it's you now have a contract. So it's up to you to when to start building your project. Again, keep in mind you have 12 months for a distributed generation project and 18 months for a community solar project. It's kind of a just a note to everyone to make sure you're entering watts and not kilowatts, and also aggregating nameplate size. So 100,000 watts for 250 kilowatt string inverters. Hopefully that will be self-correcting because we calculate the size, the DC size based on your panel size times your number of panels, and then you enter your AC system size. If those aren't within 150%, then you'll get first of all, you can see because one's right above the other, and then we'll also give you an alert that they don't meet the 150% requirement. So if you get that alert, the first thing to look at is as is mentioned, if you're using the right watts versus kilowatts. In step one, there's a question: have you already completed a project on the same parcel of land? Does that mean we applied for it already? Can you please explain this question? So essentially that question is to preclude someone from making an application, two applications for the same project. It's really there as kind of a placeholder, because in the future you may have a project that applies and builds a homeowner, for example, might put a 5 kilowatt system on their parcel, and 6 months from now they may decide to apply to put 3 more kilowatts on, and that would be a system addition, in which case they would say yes, and there would be a place for them to select that previous project. And then there's some complex math that we have to do to determine what their compensation rate is, because it has to take into account the compensation that they received for the first project versus any size changes that happened and any changes in block that happened between that and the second add-on project. Obviously, we can't have an add-on project at this point in the program because there aren't any projects that are in the program, so everything is a complete project. That functionality will come as we go forward. All right, I see that 79 of you hung on for the entire time, so thanks to all of you for that. If we'll give about 2 more minutes for any more questions to be typed in, and if we don't hear anything, we'll just ask you all to contact us with any questions you have, either via the Illinois ABP email or our phone number. And for the program itself, I guess a couple of things I'd like to share with you as the program administrator is that if there's anything that you see that you would like to be changed from a kind of a process standpoint rather than a program standpoint, then please share that with us. So there were a couple of suggestions today about it would be nice to have a summary screen, things like that. We as the program administrator have the authority to make those changes, and we can do so rather pretty rapidly, especially once the program is launched and we've gotten through the initial batch of applications. So feel free to provide any requests to us. We'll certainly consider anything that gets submitted to us. If you have a question about a change in how the program rules actually work, you can submit that to us as well. There's a more rigorous process for considering those, but we will certainly enroll those into that process. If you have any questions about what we're doing or how we're doing it, we're happy to answer those. And if there's things we can do to make the process easier for you, we're definitely cognizant of that. Couple quick questions that are left. Did the 79 of you get prioritized in the lottery? Yeah, we'll we will definitely put you all into the lottery if your applications are submitted within the lottery window. Guarantee you of that. Last question about where we can get the presentation. We'll post this on the illinoisabp.com website, and I'll put a quick pitch in for that. If you haven't already signed up on the illinoisabp.com website, at the bottom center of the website, there's a place where you can put your email address. And anytime we post an update to the program or something like the webinar, you will get an email that tells you that it's there for you to go check it out. So that's a good way for you to know what's going on without having to check the website every day. All right, thank you, everyone.